It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight for our 22nd Annual Diversity Lecture Series. We are honored to have Ethan Waters as our speaker tonight. The lecture series would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Our Diversity Champion sponsor this year is Still Case. Special thanks goes to our Social Sciences Department at GRCC, who are sponsoring our lecture tonight. Our diversity partners are Fountain Street Church, Meyer, Spectrum Health, and Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Michigan. Please take a moment to see a complete list of our diversity supporters in your program. We are very grateful for these friends and supporters. If you'd like to make a donation tonight, there are envelopes on the information table. I'd like to thank our GRCC diversity team for their continued commitment, and special thanks to the Center for Equity and Inclusion staff and all the volunteers supporting the event tonight. After the lecture, we would appreciate if you could take some time to complete the evaluation. Your feedback and suggestions are very valuable to us. Please include your email address if you would like to receive information of upcoming lectures and other center activities. After the lecture, we will have Mr. Waters out in the front or the main entrance of this building for some book signing. So if you brought your books, so you can have an opportunity to do that. Although we have limited books tonight, and we're only accepting cash and checks. To introduce our speaker, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dylan Card, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at our Social Science Department at GRCC.
Good evening. It's great to see such a wonderful turnout for tonight's lecture, although I know that most of you are forced to be here by us faculty, but it's still great to have you here anyway. So on behalf of my colleagues in the Social Science Department, I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Ethan Waters. The Social Science Department has been partnering with the Diversity Lecture Series for several years now to help sponsor speakers in conjunction with our Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. And I think the partnership is really a terrific example of the impact that this lecture series and the Bob and Aleicia Woodrick Center for Equity and Inclusion more generally have really on our ability to meet our core learning objectives at GRCC, really in ways that extend well beyond the classroom. So to that end, the Social Science Department would like to thank Domingo and Chris Arnold for their help and partnership with this. Many of the Diversity Lecture Series speakers that we have helped sponsor really focus on aspects of social justice here in the United States. However, tonight's talk expands the discussion much more globally by exploring one of the often underappreciated dimensions of globalization, really, which is the diffusion of cultural norms and ideas between countries interconnected through trade. Crazy Like Us explores the effect that our American theories and ideas about mental health and the human mind have, really when applied in cross-cultural contexts where they come in conflict with non-Western understandings of the human mind and illness. Basically, to paraphrase that, all these cultural exchanges have really resulted in us getting karaoke and the Japanese getting antidepressants. So that's kind of the trade-off with that. Tonight's speaker, Ethan Waters, is an author and journalist. Spent the last 2 decades writing about culture, psychiatry, and social psychology. Began his career writing about daycare abuse scares, satanic cult conspiracies, and other urban hysterias of the early 1990s, which, considering that it's almost Halloween, I think we should have got him up to speak about that instead of Crazy Like Us, but we got that lecture instead. So most recently, he's the author of Crazy Like Us, The Globalization of the American Psyche. That will be the topic of tonight's talk. He was the first national magazine writer to expose the excesses and mistakes of therapists who led their patients to uncover recovered memories of early childhood abuse. That work culminated in a co-authorship with UC Berkeley social psychologist Richard Ofshe of Making Monsters, False Memories, Psychotherapy, and Sexual Hysteria, a groundbreaking indictment of the recovered memory movement. Waters has contributed to the New York Times Magazine, Discoverer, Pacific Standard, Mother Jones, Men's Journal, Details, Wired, and This American Life, and his writing on the new research surrounding epigenetics was featured in the 2003 Best American Science and Nature Writing Series. Waters is also co-founder of the San Francisco Writers Grotto, a workspace for journalists, novelists, poets, and filmmakers. He also has a deep sense of irony, considering that he has written a book, Urban Tribes, about single adults who never get married, and several other books that were highly critical of psychiatry, yet he himself is married to a psychiatrist in here. So just let me conclude by saying that Ethan is an exceptional science writer, really has a rare ability to take science-ese and translate that back to standard English for the rest of us, really without losing the subtlety and the nuance in this subject matter. So we are grateful to have him here to speak tonight. So without further ado, please help me in having a big Grand Rapids welcome for Ethan Waters.
Thank you so much for coming out. I've talked around the world about this book. This book's been translated in over 10 other languages. I've gone to Australia and Germany and around the world speaking about it. I've never spoken in a room this august or had a speaking system that was this booming. Actually, the strangest, the most unnerving place this book ever got me was on the, I was on the Daily Show with Jon Stewart a few years back when Jon Stewart was still doing it, and that was an interesting experience, and I was just thinking about Jon Stewart recently because I kind of miss him. So at the end of the lecture, at the very end, after the Q&A, if we have any, it was such an interesting experience that I wrote the top 10 things that you need to know before going on the Daily Show. So as dessert for this whole thing, I will share with you the top 10 things you need to know before going on the Daily Show. So this book, working on this book for me has honestly changed the way I think about the human mind and the human creature. So you've given up the Cubs game, you've come out into the rain tonight. I really appreciate you all showing up. So hopefully I can, in this short talk, change the way you think about the human mind. So this book was not based on my research. I'm indebted to cross-cultural psychiatrists and researchers who have created a remarkable body of research that shows that mental illnesses are not, as sometimes assumed, spread evenly around the globe, that in fact they change distinctly throughout time and across places. The research suggests that what we are missing from our understanding of mental illness is the cultural shaping and molding of the symptoms and disorders. What has become clear is that because the troubled mind is deeply influenced by religious beliefs, scientific theories about the mind, shared beliefs about where illness comes from, whether those be biomedical or social or spiritual, that the forms of madness from one place and time in history often look remarkably different from those in another time and place. And I think this is critical to understand now because of the cultural impact of globalization, how quickly cultures are changing, and how deeply we in the West influence those cultures around the world. So the premise of this book is that we in the West, and particularly in America, have a great deal of influence over mental illnesses, how they're treated, how they're diagnosed, how they're categorized. We are changing the way the world thinks about mental illness, and in the process, I believe we are actually changing the expressions of those illnesses. So the first question I'll take on is do mental illnesses change over time in their prevalence? And I think looking back across history, is the quickest way to convince you that culture does indeed shape mental illnesses. Ian Hacking wrote a book called Mad Travelers, and he documented a rare fugue state that was in Victorian-era England, where men would walk for hundreds of miles with no sense of their identity, no idea of where they'd been, and apparently no memory. Of course, hysteria is perhaps the most prominent example of a culturally shaped mental illness. In the mid-19th century, women by the hundreds of thousands began to display the remarkable symptoms of hysteria, the nervous tics, the fainting, the sensitivity to touch, the physical paralysis. It was a remarkably common illness all across Europe, and then it spread to America. It could not have been more clear to the clinicians that treated it or the people that suffered from it. Disorders like anorexia and bulimia, and even broader categories like anxiety and depression also can be seen to ebb and flow across generations. So what's driving these changes? What's causing one symptom to be in one time and not to be in another time? Medical historian Edward Shorter from the University of Toronto describes how different times and different places have what he calls symptom pools. And these symptoms are not random. People at a given moment in history in need of expressing their psychological suffering have a limited number of symptoms to choose from. The symptom pool allows a person to take troubling emotions or internal conflicts that are often indistinct or frustratingly beyond expression and distilling them into a symptom or behavior that at that moment in human history is a culturally recognized signal of suffering. So that, of course, leads to the obvious question, which is how does a symptom end up in one symptom pool at one time and not another? Shorter, for his part, suggests that the key players in this are the healers. And in one culture, that might be a priest or a shaman. In another culture, it might be a doctor or a researcher. These experts propose theories about how the mind works, he believes, and then they look for the symptoms that confirm those theories. Shorter says this. He says, patients unconsciously endeavor to produce the symptoms that will correspond to the medical diagnostics of the time. This sort of cultural molding of the unconscious happens imperceptibly and follows a large number of cultural cues that the patient is simply not aware of. So he's describing an unconscious process. So here's a famous painting of French neurologist Charcot working with a hysterical patient who has just fainted into his arms. And the question is basically this: would this woman have displayed this particular symptom of fainting without the expectant gaze of all these learned men predicting this exact behavior? And I think what we're learning is that the behavior and the expectation are very much intertwined and form sort of a confirming loop. The patient behavior is affected by the expectation, but the display of that symptom then reinforces the certainty on the part of the experts that their theories about the mind and the illness are correct. So I want to be clear right here from the start. Culturally shaped illnesses like hysteria or mad travelers or anorexia are not a matter of patients faking symptoms. What I'm describing is how the unconscious mind learns to speak the language of suffering that is understood in its particular time and place. Symptoms of mental illness are communications of distress. The unconscious mind selects the symptoms that will be understood in its particular moment. So this is not to suggest that mental illnesses are an illusion, that they are only the expression of culture, or that they are in some nefarious way can be blamed on the doctors. I'm only saying that we will not fully understand these illnesses until we understand how culture interacts with them. So the cultural impact on a mental illness does not make a mental illness in any way less real. So I had a sort of a front row seat for, in my first book, Making Monsters, for the expression of a culturally sort of created set of symptomologies. I first started to understand this connection when I wrote in the early 90s about the recovered memory controversy. This was when thousands of mostly women would be going into therapy and uncovering memories of what they believed were early childhood abuse. Oftentimes those memories evolved into beliefs about satanic cults in our midst that would kill and abuse children with impunity. At the end of the day, these cults were not discovered. There was no national network of satanic cults abusing and killing children. Recovered memory movement was built on a coercive form of therapy that all but guaranteed patients would come up with a certain set of memories. And this is one book, this is by one of the leading clinicians of the movement, Colin Ross, a full proponent in the belief that there were satanic cults abusing children by the thousands. These were, these were leading researchers and clinicians at major dissociative disorder units who were behind these ideas. And the movement spawned dozens of books and films, thousands of newspaper articles and television stories. These are just a few of them. Michelle Remembers is one of the main books. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Patients, interestingly, often during this period of developing these memories, developed what was then called multiple personality disorder. It's now called dissociative identity disorder. It was once thought to be a very rare disease, and suddenly it shot up in prevalence. Thousands of patients believed that their early abuse had literally shattered their consciousness into pieces, allowing them to switch between personalities that had no knowledge or memory of each other. It was such a dramatic diagnosis, it was really kind of irresistible to people in the press and to people that did talk shows. Sybil was perhaps the most famous book on the topic of multiple personality disorder. So through the 1990s, you saw this remarkable rise in prominence of the disorder. And for a relatively short period of time, MBT became the symptom of the moment. It was the way troubled people were expected to act and display their distress. It was our generation's hysteria in some way. So in that first book, I argued that MBT was clearly a culturally shaped phenomenon, that this was iatrogenic, that it was something that required the participation of the healers that interacted with these people. But the question remained after I wrote that book. So, okay, it's culturally shaped, but to what extent is it still in some real degrees real? And if that's true, to what extent are other illnesses, other mental illnesses in particular, shaped by culture? And I thought about that question really sort of sat in my mind for years, and with the question of like, how would I even begin to take apart that idea? How would I go about it? And I finally went back to it, and I began to sort of read Edward Shorter and other people, and I began to realize that this is a wider, how something gets into the symptom pool is actually probably wider than simply the doctors, but it's a larger cultural phenomenon. So I began to sort of think of the ways in which people are participating in filling that symptom pool. And certainly there's the experts and quasi-experts that exist in our culture. There's drug and other treatment suppliers, including big pharma. There's celebrities who often are the people that come down with these disorders and become the proponents of them. And there's media and the journalists like myself. Journalists, when they hear of the new disorder, they flock to the story. It's a great story. It assures placement of your article. It's exciting. It's new. We never stop to think as journalists that in our advertising and talking about something like, say, bulimia, et cetera, that we are perhaps being part of the people that are putting this idea into a population in a given moment. So I'll give you an example of a symptom that suddenly appeared in the symptom pool for a particular population. And this one really was driven by media and celebrity. This is a graph of bulimia rates in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s. And can anyone guess which celebrity I'm going to now mention? So this is, I'm going to talk about Princess Diana, who in the early 1990s, rumors began to circulate in the British press that the princess was suffering from bulimia, and this also came out in Andrew Morton's Diana, Her True Story, suggested this during this first rise. And for many, this was really their first introduction to the illness. This was brand new. This is a new disorder, perhaps the most famous woman in the country or in the world, and journalists, flocked to this story. Thousands of articles, news stories, news segments about this. And many experts came forward talking about, with books and giving interviews to explain what the princess was suffering from. I have this interesting little drop here, and this coincides remarkably well with the time that she separated from Prince Charles. She attempted to sort of go out of the public eye. She denied absolutely that she had suffered from bulimia. Then in 1994, she re-enters public life with a new book, confirms that she did indeed suffer from bulimia, and spoke about it publicly in interviews. Then in 1996, she again attempts to go out of the public eye, and she dies in a car crash in August of 97. So there are several possible explanations for this. One is that, offered by some researchers in the UK, suggesting that her revelations decreased the decreased the stigma. It increased awareness about this disorder, and this allowed women to come forward and identify that they indeed suffered from this. So that could be partially responsible for the rise we see here. But what I found remarkable is nowhere did the mental health profession consider the other possible explanation, and that is that troubled women were being drawn to this particular symptom because this extremely well-known and famous person was repeating on a daily basis in the popular press that this symptom was how she expressed her unhappiness. So I think having witnessed the rise and fall of so many different types of illnesses throughout history, I believe that this is the most likely possibility, that she was literally creating this kind of gravity around this expression of distress. And I think the evidence is now in that culture does indeed influence symptoms from time period to time period. And the next question for me was, can one culture influence another? So the book really, the day I knew I was going to write this book was the day I interviewed this man, Lawrence Kermayer. He's a professor of cross-cultural psychiatry up in McGill. And I was up there writing an article about epigenetics, which was just breaking my brain, and I took the afternoon off because I was a fan of his work and I wanted to talk to him about these ideas. And he's the world leading expert on different cultural expressions of depression-like states. And he sat me down in his office and told me a story of being invited by GlaxoSmithKline in 2001 to Kyoto, Japan for a conference. And those times, and still is, it's not unusual for a drug company to offer travel to experts to come to their conferences and speak with them. But Kermayer said, like, this one seemed different right away. And I said, how so? And he said, well, I got the plane ticket, and it was a first-class plane ticket to Japan. And then he went on to describe the hotel that he was put up in Kyoto. It was this palatial hotel. He said there was fruit laid out on the credenza that was so unusual that he couldn't identify any of it, and the rose petals in the bathtub drawn for him already. He said this was like Gordon Gekko treatment, and he said he began to wonder, what did I do to deserve this? Well, GlaxoSmithKline had made a very big bet that it could sell its antidepressant Paxil in Japan, but the company faced one large problem. There was no guarantee that the Japanese doctors would prescribe the drug or the population would be interested in taking it. The country did have a clinical diagnosis for depression. It's often translated as endogenous depression, but it was considered actually a very rare and very severe mental disorder where you would be usually hospitalized for months if you had it. Japan, of course, did have other experiences of sadness. Indeed, anthropologists will tell you that it is a very, in some ways, very sad culture. It's the culture that embraces experiences of sadness. You can see this in the drama, you can see this in their song and their spirituality. The Japanese culture generally has a respect for the emotional state of sadness that Americans don't quite understand. And there are very few sadness experiences that were put into the illness category. So during the Kyoto meeting, Kermayer slowly began to understand why GlaxoSmithKline was so interested in his knowledge about how cultures shape the illness experience. To make Paxil a hit in Japan, it would not be enough to corner the small market of those diagnosed with endogenous depression. Their objective was to change at the most fundamental level the Japanese understanding of sadness and depression. In short, they wanted to learn how to market not just a pill, but a disease. And to have the best chance of shifting the Japanese public perception about the meaning of depression, GlaxoSmithKline needed a deep and sophisticated understanding of how those beliefs had taken shape. And this was why Kermayer came to understand that the company had invited him and his colleagues and treated them like such royalty. GlaxoSmithKline needed help solving a cultural puzzle that could be worth billions of dollars. And Kermayer told the assembled executives what he knew about the cultural shaping of depression-like states, and indeed he knew a great deal. He told them about how a Nigerian man might experience a culturally distinct form of depression by describing a peppery feeling in his head, or how a rural Chinese farmer might speak only of shoulder pain and stomach ache, or how a man in India might talk of semen loss, or a sinking heart, or a feeling hot. Kermayer research showed that cultures often differ in what he called explanatory models for depression-like states. And this is very similar to Shorter's idea of the symptom pool. Different cultures have different beliefs about how the body and mind works, and those cultural beliefs and stories have the effect of directing attention of the individual towards certain feelings and to ignore others. He calls this a cycle of symptom amplification. So in one culture, someone feeling an inchoate distress might be prompted to search for a feeling of unease in his gut or in muscle pain. In another time and place, it would be a different symptom that would be accepted as legitimate. Explanatory models create the culturally expected experiences of the disease in the mind of the sufferer. So Kermayer spent a lot of time after that conference thinking about how GlaxoSmithKline took that information, and in the end, I think he now realizes that his comments were probably exactly what GlaxoSmithKline wanted to hear, that cultural conceptions surrounding illness, such as depression, could be influenced and shifted over time. And he made that very clearly when he wrote a few years later about the experience. And I'll read a quote from it. He says, "The clinical presentation of depression and anxiety is a function not only of the patient's ethnocultural backgrounds, but of the structure of the healthcare system they find themselves in, and the diagnostic categories and conceptions they encounter in mass media, in the dialogue with family and friends, and clinicians. In a globalizing world," he goes on, "these conceptions are in constant transaction and transformation across boundaries of race, culture, class, and nation. And in this context, it is important to recognize that psychiatry itself is part of an international subculture that imposes certain categories on the world." So in other words, cultural beliefs about depression and the self are malleable and responsive to messages that can be exported from one culture to another. One culture can reshape how a population in another categorizes a given set of symptoms, replace their explanatory models, replace their symptom pool, and redraw the line demarcating normal behavior and internal states from those considered pathological. So when Cormier first told me that story, I knew I wanted to write a book about this, but I also wanted to know one thing right away. I wanted to know how much was GlaxoSmithKline, how much did they know that they were doing this? To what extent was this intentional, or was this just globalization doing its thing? And he said this to me, he said, "What I was witnessing was a multinational pharmaceutical corporation working hard to redefine narratives about mental health. These changes have far-reaching effects informing the cultural conceptions of personhood and how people conduct their everyday lives. And this is happening on a global scale. We are upending long-held cultural beliefs about the meaning of illness and healing." So I knew I wanted to write a book, and so I went looking for other vectors, for other stories about how America was influencing not only the treatment, not only the categorization of these illnesses, but also to some degrees influencing the behavior and the symptomology itself. And I find it's easy to see cultural currents in the rearview mirror, and we can even, pity those clinicians and the journalists back in when hysteria was prominent and think, oh, how unfortunate that they were so drawn by culture. We can get easy agreement, looking back on hysteria, that this was driven with undercurrents of misogyny, mistaken beliefs about a woman's anatomy, fear of female sexuality, assumptions of female mental weakness. We can see all that very clearly. And I think every generation of mental health provider can see these mistakes of the last generation. Even MPD now, if you talk to providers today, they'll look back and say, oh, well, that was driven by those cultural currents that were there, but now we're doing something else. It is so much harder to see what's happening in a given moment in time than it is to see it in the rearview mirror. So the book, I have 4 examples. There's the Paxil in Japan. There are 4 long chapters in the book. Changing conceptions of schizophrenia in Africa, in Zanzibar in particular. The rise of an American form of anorexia in Hong Kong, just at the moment that Hong Kong was doing its changeover from British to Chinese rule. But for the 4th example, which I think I'll talk about mostly in the remainder of this talk, is the example that's really current in our moment in history. And it's much harder to see and much harder to wrap our minds around, I think. So in the US, there are 1.4 million veterans are returning home, and many of them will clearly be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the hypervigilance, the easily startled, the flashbacks, the anxiety. And for them, could not be more real a disorder. But the simple but mind-bending truth is that mental illnesses such as PTSD can be both culturally shaped and utterly real for the sufferer. At McGill University, there's another anthropologist named Alan Young who's written a great deal about PTSD, and he told me, he said, PTSD can be real in a particular place and time, and yet not true for all places and time. So I'll come back to these veterans in a minute, but as I suggested before, there's only a couple of ways to see these cultural differences. One is to look across history, and one is to look across cultures. And so with PTSD, that's what I did, and I took as my sort of prime example the Boxing Day tsunami that struck the Indian Ocean in December of 2004. And after that disaster, there was this remarkable culture clash between when Western trauma counselors rushed into the rim of the Indian Ocean with the best of intentions, with all manner of Western counseling techniques, and the assumption and deeply Western assumptions about PTSD and the human reaction to trauma. So here's a trauma counselor in the West working with some children. Here's a fellow doing art therapy, some guided visualization. There were the Scientologists were on the scene. There are thought field therapists. There's rapid eye movement therapists. But most of them carried with them the Western checklist for PTSD, believing this was the symptoms to be looking for. And the confidence that these Western mental health professionals had in the universality of this symptomology is quite remarkable. Despite this certainty, however, the truth is that PTSD symptom checklist does not account for the various pathological reactions to trauma in different cultures or at different times and places in human history. Cultural meaning matters after a bad event, and symptoms vary across culture. Around the world, one can find a multiplicity of reactions to trauma. These varying reactions emanate and are always tied to local notions of the self and modes of healing available to those populations. So, for example, Cambodian refugees fleeing from their protracted civil war, often the most pressing psychological impact of the trauma was being visited by vengeful spirits of the dead and the accompanying feeling of intense distress that in escaping the country, they had not been able to perform the rituals for their deceased loved ones. Salvadorian women refugees who endured their protracted civil war often experienced something called calorius, which is often described as an intense feeling of heat in the body. In Afghanistan, people describe a type of nervous anger and the sensation of internal stress and pressure. Symptoms vary. The Western view of PTSD is simply not universal. To see the difference, but to understand those differences and to understand a culture's current symptom pool, it actually requires a lot of effort and a lot of research. And I was lucky to come across the work of Gaither Fernando. She's an associate professor at college in Los Angeles, and she's a specialist in this area, and she happened to be in Sri Lanka doing research on the day of the tsunami, and she saw the Western world gearing up to offer psychological help, and she worried that the PTSD symptom checklist did not reflect the culturally particular ways Sri Lankans experience emotional suffering after trauma. So to understand what was actually there, she began to do a study, and what she did was she gathered people who had all personally witnessed the tsunami, and she had them instead of like going down the PTSD checklist, she had them tell her long stories about their reactions to the trauma, who was doing bad in the community, who was doing well, and then she began to piece apart symptoms, and then she did a larger study to validate the results. And she ended up what she calls the Sri Lankan Index of Psychosocial Suffering. It's a 26-item measure of local indicators of distress. So how do these symptoms differ from Western notions of PTSD? Well, Fernando came to the conclusion that Sri Lankans experience trauma differed from Americans in two major ways. Unlike the PTSD symptomology, Sri Lankans were much more likely to experience physical symptoms after horrible events, aches in the joints, muscle aches, stomach pains. So without that mind-body disconnect that's common in Western thinking, these Sri Lankans reacted to the disaster almost literally like they experienced a blow to the body. In addition to those somatic symptoms, there was another more subtle and, I think, pervasive difference. By and large, Sri Lankans didn't report reactions to the trauma in line with internal mental states, like those of anxiety, fear, numbing, and the like, that make up most of the PTSD symptom checklist. They didn't mark those as the primary symptoms, that is. Rather, Sri Lankans tended to see the negative consequences of events like the tsunami in terms of the damage it did to social roles and relationships. So those who continued to suffer long after a horrible experience, her research showed, were those who had become isolated from their social network or who had lost or were not fulfilling their role in the kinship group. In short, they conceived of the damage done by the tsunami as occurring not inside the mind, but outside the self in the social environment. So Sri Lankans interwove the social and the psychological to the point where the two could not be teased apart. For a Sri Lankan, the primary symptom exists not in the psychological, but in the social realm. So here's the problem. When Western counselors imply that they know the true reactions to trauma and the best ways to heal, they are not only disconnecting local people from local modes of suffering, but they're often disconnecting them from local modes of healing. For a symptom that exists in the body, a treatment that addresses those physical symptoms might work best. For a symptom that focuses on the disconnect from the social group, one might need an intervention that focuses on that aspect of the distress. And something like individual counseling would be exactly the wrong intervention. You talk to anthropologists about our efforts to rush into other cultures with mental health treatments, and sometimes they're literally dumbfounded by the assumption that the psychological consequences of trauma are similar to a newly discovered disease, and that local populations would be utterly unaware of what happens to the human mind after terrible events. That implicit assumption leaves anthropologists just shaking their head in disbelief. And I do think it takes a willful blindness that other cultures need our framework of understanding the human response to trauma. Arthur Kleinman, who's a medical anthropologist at Harvard, gave me the most sort of cutting quote on this. He said to me, you know, most disasters in the world happen outside of the West, yet we come in, we pathologize their reactions, we say, you don't know how to live with this situation, we take their cultural narratives away from them and we impose ours. It's a terrible example of dehumanizing people, he said. So here's a Western trauma counselor teaching some active listening, and it seems sort of mean-spirited to criticize him. People do this interventions with the best of intentions. They're trying to help. But I think once one comprehends the cultural differences in psychological reactions to trauma, the efforts of Western traumatologists who rush into disaster zones on a few days' notice, without knowing the language, without a deep understanding of the religion, without an understanding of the modes of mourning and the rituals for grieving, and no notions of the local modes of distress or healing, the whole endeavor begins to look quite problematic. And to drive that point home, a researcher I talked to once asked me, he said, consider this in reverse. He said, how would we feel if after 9/11, shaman from Mozambique came over and began knocking on doors of the survivors saying, we need to lead you through this certain set of rituals in order to, so the spirit of your dead relative can be released. How would that sit with us? Would that make any sense at all? And of course it wouldn't, but we seem to have no trouble doing what is basically the same thing in reverse. And I think I know why we do that. I think we think what we have to offer is science, is universal, is proven by the research around PTSD. But what's true is that even PTSD in our culture, even if you just take Western culture, and if you just take soldiers in Western culture over time, you can see how this reaction to trauma, the symptomology after trauma changes over time. So if you were a soldier, a British soldier in the Boer Wars, and you had a negative reaction to experience in battle, you were likely to complain of joint pain and muscle weakness, and this was a condition their doctors at the time called debility syndrome. If you were a soldier in the American Civil War and had a bad reaction to trauma, you would likely complain of aching in the left side of your chest, of having the feeling of a weak heartbeat, of having this pathological form of homesickness. This was called DaCosta's syndrome. If you were a soldier in the First World War, you might have experienced something that came to be known as shell shock. And these symptoms included grotesque body movement, nervous tics, physical paralysis. Does this sound like something I mentioned before? This is very similar to hysteria, right? These symptomologies happen in the same sort of period of time, same ideas about how the body was wired with these wires that could be damaged, that would show these very physical symptoms. It was actually only rather recently that soldiers began to describe their primary symptoms in terms of the intrusive thoughts, the memory avoidance, the uncontrollable anxiety and arousal that makes up the core of the PTSD diagnosis. And indeed, even in our lifetime, or my lifetime, some of you are much younger than I am, we've seen this conception of PTSD shift. It actually, in its modern form, began as something called post-Vietnam syndrome. And it began it sort of was developed in these hothouse rap sessions with these Vietnam veterans against the war who got together with these New York psychoanalysts, and they began to sort of create this idea of the symptom. But as they described it at the time, it really sounds nothing like it does today. And here's one of the psychoanalysts writing in the New York Times in 1972 describing it. He says, "These veterans are suffering psychologically because they had been deceived, used, and betrayed by both the military and society at large. So the diagnosis of post-Vietnam syndrome was intended to highlight the psychological cost of participating in a war that many perceived as unjust." So a couple generations later, the concept of PTSD has come a long way from that post-Vietnam syndrome with its overt anti-war meaning. And here's a soldier going through some modern treatment for desensitization. So as it evolved away from post-Vietnam syndrome and into its modern, more clinical form, PTSD largely left behind the quest for social meaning in tragedy. And I think this to that says a great deal about the way Americans like to think about mental illness. We clinicalize it, we individualize it, we believe it is scrubbed of culture. But I think this medicalization of trauma in particular is deeply problematic. In doing this, we isolate those strugglings in the aftermath of trauma. So in contrast to those angry but socially engaged Vietnam veterans, the frustrations or angers or unhappiness of the modern soldiers have been moved from the social, where one might find moral anger or nationalistic justification or religious meaning in their sacrifice, to the individual, to the biopsychomedical. And I think this is important to understand because PTSD is an idea that we are exporting to the rest of the world at an enormous rate. Derek Summerfield of King's College, who's worked extensively with victims of war and genocide, wrote this. He said, "We invite people to see a widening range of experiences as liable to make them ill. This becomes problematic because we are a globalizing culture. We are presenting just one version of human nature, one set of ideas about pain and suffering as being definitive. In truth, there is no one psychology." So these cultural differences clearly affect, and cultural currents clearly affect the expression of mental illness. And for the last part of the talk, I'd like to sort of bring it out to a different level, because this is sort of the hidden message of the book, which is that all our minds are influenced deeply by the cultural water we swim in, to a much greater degree than we in the West generally appreciate. So researchers, and these are the people not doing research about mental illness, but doing research on psychological mechanisms in the human mind. Almost all of that research over the last 30 years has been done on one particular population, which is sophomores at colleges, because they're the ones that are easy to get into the lab. We've done a huge amount of research on all these aspects of cognition, from like ideas of fairness, ideas of sense of self, obedience to authority, how we perceive and describe the natural world, the way we infer the motivations of others, how we categorize things, our moral reasoning, spatial reasoning. And what we're learning is that as you take these studies across cultures, you find we weren't actually seeing just the one human brain, we were seeing a very particular culturally created brain. This is one of the oldest sort of experiments, and this is called the Miller-Lyer illusion. And you can tell that line B is larger than line A, but in fact, if you put these lines over each other, line A and line B are identically the same length. If you show this same image to a San forager in the Kalahari, they will see this illusion much less than a Western audience will see the illusion. Where you grow up and the environments you grow up in determine a great deal, including things like visual perception. So because you were surrounded your whole life by carpentered corners, your visual perception is adapted to that environment to see these sort of angles as suggesting the lines are further off and therefore larger, or closer and therefore smaller. So they've taken a number of tests, and I'll do one for you. We could just do it in our minds. This is one of the tests they've taken across culture. Imagine I give you each $100, and I tried to get the sponsors of this talk to actually do this, but they apparently didn't have enough money. But imagine I gave you $100, and the only restriction is that you have an unseen partner outside the room who you have to give some portion of that money to. With this caveat, if they decide not to accept your offer, neither of you get anything. So just for a moment, like, okay, so given that, you have to give some money to this other person. They can refuse the offer, and you both get nothing. So just sort of imagine for a second, like, how much of that $100 you'd give them. Okay, now for a second, imagine that you're the unseen partner, and you've been offered, like, at what point would you begin to consider refusing the offer, given that you know that there's $100 at stake and you know all the rules of the game too? At what point would you begin to sort of say, no, that doesn't seem fair to me? So when you're in the offering party, when you're the person that had to determine whether to give, how much to give, how many people sort of thought somewhere between 40 and 50%? You'd give 40 and 50%. Yeah. How many would give under 20%? All right, someone back there, all right? So the 40, 50% is what you find in Western cultures. People tend to give, really pretty close to 50%. How many of you would begin to sort of think about refusing the offer at around 30%? 20%? Begin to refuse? Okay. So they've done this study. This study was this sort of test is prominent in psychology, but also in economics. And what researchers assumed was they were seeing something that was really hardwired. This is like, because it feels hardwired, like fairness feels hardwired. We know when something feels fair, and we know when it doesn't. We don't do a lot of thinking about it. We just have this gut feeling. And we assumed when we were doing the studies for all these years that those sophomores in colleges would start, have the same hardwiring as everyone else around the world. But begin to take these tests across cultures, as Joe Henrich from the University of British Columbia began to do. Here he is doing this exact same test that I just described to you with some members of the Machigenga tribe in the Amazon. And for them, almost always the offering party will give the lowest possible offer. And almost always the person on the other end of the deal will accept the lowest possible offer. They simply have a fundamentally different conception of where that fairness is. And you can find examples in other cultures, like in island cultures that are based on sort of systems of gift giving. And you can find societies that will give more than 50%, and the person on the other end will refuse the extra generous offer because it comes with these cultural ideas about obligation of reciprocity. So you take these studies around the world, and you begin to see this multiplicity of things. So that's fairness, and we talked about visual perception. Joe Henrich, Ara Norazayan, and Steve Hine, all at the University of British Columbia, all research in psychology doing this, began to collect this data from all these studies that have been suddenly being taken across cultures. And they wrote this brilliant, and I highly recommend it, long piece in Behavioral and Brain Science in 2010, and it was titled "The Weirdest People in the World." In their case, there was only one group of people that appeared to be particularly unusual when compared to other populations, with perceptions, behaviors, motivations, notions of fairness. There was one group that was almost always sliding down one end of the bell curve. So by weird, they meant both truly unusual, but also as an acronym, it was Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So they conclude, and I quote from the paper, Americans, particularly American participants, are exception even within the unusual population of Westerners. They are outliers among outliers. Given the data, they conclude that social scientists could not possibly have picked a worse population from which to draw broad generalizations about the human mind. Researchers have been doing the equivalent of studying penguins, believing that they were gaining insights that were applicable to all birds. And we, I have to say, are the penguins. So the weird Western mind tends to be the most self-aggrandizing. It's the most egotistical on the planet. we're more likely to promote ourselves at the expense of the group. We also tend to be more analytic, possessed with minds that tend to telescope in on the object of interest rather than seeing the object in its context around it. And so I think we think differently because of our cognition is shaped by culture in the same way our language is shaped by culture and place. In one critical way, we're different than much of the rest of the world, including much of the East. And in this I was influenced very much by a psychologist at Stanford named Hazel Rose Marcus, who suggested that people in different cultures have strikingly different conceptions of themselves, particularly in terms of how they viewed the self as whether it was independent from others or interdependent with them. So the interdependent self, which is more the norm in East Asian countries, including Japan and China, interlocks the self with others in the social group and favors social harmony over self-expression. The independent mind, which is prominent in the West and America in particular, conceives of the self as the individual that exists apart from the group. The independent self is very similar to that internal, so you could see this idea in the Sri Lankan example, how the interdependent self was critical to understanding how to react to traumas. So one question is, if this is so true, if culture shapes cognition so much, and we've studied psychology for so long, like, how have we been missing this? Why is it just now that we're coming to terms with this cultural shaping of the mind? And I think our blindness to the influence of culture really does make sense given our independent view of the self. That analytic Western mind, that we take things out of the context, I think is fundamentally a mistake. You cannot take the human mind out of its cultural context, because what the human mind does best is mimic the culture it exists in. So we may have underestimated the impact of culture because the very ideas of being subject to the will of a larger historical currents, or of unconsciously mimicking the cognition or symptomology of those around us, really fundamentally challenges our Western conception of the self as that independent, self-determined mind. So I believe the historical mistakes of the Western researchers, in other words, have been the predictable consequences of the weird mind doing the thinking. So I'd like to leave you with one last question. What if we in the West are fundamentally misguided about that belief in the independent mind? What if the human creature, even when mentally ill, is innately interdependent? That we are not masters of our own ship, but mimickers of cultures. That we are deeply reliant on each other. And what if those Western beliefs about that independent self is causing some fundamental distress? I've been thinking about American politics a lot recently, and so here's a woman at a Tea Party event, and she wants freedom. She would accept nothing less, which is, of course, different than the people on the far right who want total freedom. But, and not to make any comments about either of these groups, just to point out the sort of oddness of the fact that these people seem to desire total independent freedom, but have the need to get together in large groups of like-minded people to express that belief. Steve Martin used to do, when he did his college comedy tour, he used to do this thing where he would lead large groups of college students in a chant of like, I am independent, I am independent. I think for myself, I think for myself. So we have this idea of individual freedom and in the independent self as sort of a moral good, as central to what the human being is, even as we advocated for it in large groups of others. But what is certain is that other places in the world, cultural conception of the mind remain more intertwined with a variety of religious, cultural beliefs, as well as the ecology and the social world. They have not yet separated the mind from the body, nor have they disconnected the individual mental health from the mental health of the group. And it is with little appreciation of these differences that we continue our efforts to convince the rest of the world to think like us. And given the level of contentment and psychological health our cultural beliefs about the mind have brought us, I think it's perhaps time that we rethink that generosity. So thank you very much. So I would very much love if we do just a couple of questions. I would very much love if someone had wanted to brave the walk to those microphones so far away. If not, I can go right on to telling you about the Jon Stewart Show. The 10 things you need to know about before going on the Daily Show, which is no longer useful because Jon Stewart's no longer there. Does anyone have any questions? I'd also be happy to answer your questions in the foyer afterwards and shake your hand. And if you would like to share an anecdote with me or ask a question, I'd be there as well. 3, 2, 1. Terrific. Okay, so we'll go on. So here's proof. Oh, I'm sorry. Fantastic. Nope. Someone's leaving. Damn, we almost had one. It's okay, I'd be happy to answer questions later. It's an imposing room. All right, so there's proof I was on the Daily Show. Whoops, okay, so number one thing you need to know before going on the Daily Show, don't expect any warm-up. Jon Stewart comes into the green room before the show and chats with you for about 3 minutes. In my case, the conversation focused exclusively on the contents of the Daily Show gift bag. Number two, you'll have about an hour to hang out and get nervous before you go on. A staff member on the show is there to distract you. In my case, she told me of the story of one former interviewee who sweated so profusely that he nearly shorted out his lavalier microphone. To be fair to the staffer, the context of this story was that rarely happens. Whoops. So number three, you will only see the set 30 seconds before you walk on. When they need you, a production assistant will lead you down a series of grim hallways past groups of hipsters, writers perhaps hanging out in the break room. You'll be thinking, this is not very glamorous. Your eyes will be drawn to all exit signs. Number four, do not look at the audience as you walk out onto the set. Look only at the familiar face of Jon Stewart and know that he will get you through this. Trust in him. Number five, do not think any of the following thoughts. All my ex-girlfriends are watching this. Whatever happens in the next 5 minutes will live forever on the web. Better not screw this up. Okay. Number six, do not try to be funny unless you are funny. If you are not sure that you're funny, assume that you are not. And if you try to be in this situation, you'll look like an incredible jackass because you're sitting next to someone who is preternaturally hilarious. Number seven, oh, this was the worst one. When you start to speak, large images of your face will appear on monitors around the set. If you look at those images of yourself, your mind will freeze and then explode. Look only at Jon. You'll only have to say a sentence or two before he'll jump in with a zinger. Number eight, do not laugh too hard at the zingers there for the people watching at home. If you start giggling, the interview is going to grind to a halt. Number nine, bask in the post-interview handshake. This is the moment when they're cutting away to commercial and the host leans in to shake your hand and say something just between the two of you. I can't tell you what Jon said to me during those 5 seconds except to say that it was of a highly personal nature. Number 10, try not to open the copious amounts of liquor in the gift bag until you're out of the building and safely in the town car on your way back to the hotel. And this is a footnote. What is in the Daily Show gift bag? Glad you asked. 1 Monopoly board game, 1 huge bottle of cherry-flavored vodka in case you want to get some high school kids hammered after the show, 1 bottle of 1800 tequila, a package of those Nespresso packets but no machine by which to actually make an espresso, 1 Daily Show hat, which I still have, 1 Daily Show t-shirt, and 1 gift certificate to get a professional photographic portrait of your pet in case you're ever traveling through New York with your dog. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I really appreciate it. I look forward to meeting you out there.